Well, it's 12 o'clock, so why don't we get started? Good day, everyone. I'm Jim Erwin. I'm the Employment Group Practice Group Leader at Pierce Atwood in the Portland, Maine office. And presenting with me today is Suzanne King, also a partner on our Employment Group. And Suzanne works in the Boston and Portsmouth, New Hampshire offices. I want to welcome you all to our discussion today. We are so glad that we can finally start talking about today's webinar topic. Spring seems finally to have taken hold, at least here in Maine. We're always about the last state to get there. We're glad that there's some hope of finding our way out of this dark tunnel of uncertainty that we've all been struggling with. I want to, just a quick housekeeping matter, I want to clean up any lingering uncertainty about the number of webinars and alerts that we're doing on this topic. We're doing 3 alerts, we've done 2, and we have 1 more to go later this week. But right now, we only have this webinar scheduled on this topic. If that changes, of course, we'll send out notices, but this is the only webinar currently scheduled. So there's a lot of discussion about reopening the economy, and which seems like a bit of a misnomer for those of us who've been dealing with HR issues for the last month or so, because there was no slowing down of work, at least that I've noticed, and I don't think my colleagues have noticed it either, and I'm sure most of you haven't noticed it. But it has been new work, and it's been unfamiliar in the sense of new laws and programs coming at us all at once. And at a very uncomfortably fast pace, we've had to react to those and then implement changes and make decisions. But now I think we can take a little bit of a breath. And unlike the speed with which the coronavirus and the shutdown orders have clamped down on our workplaces, the resumption of operations is going to be a slower and more incremental process for which the vast majority of workplaces will have time to plan. The uncertainty is not going away because the timetable isn't clear and the economic harm yet to fall on our various organizations is not yet clear either. But even so, with all that said, there are some very clear and positive things that we can be doing now in order to be ready. So before we get into the specifics of planning to bring back our workforces, I thought it might be helpful to review a few key things that our government leaders are looking at as very key data in connection with a safe resumption of wide-scale work. Now, we know of the need to get people back to work, that it has to be balanced with the risk of overwhelming our healthcare system. And the Massachusetts High Tech Council has given this issue some very serious consideration, and it has essentially boiled the Balance Act down to 3 things. Delay the return to work, rather, of the most vulnerable, what they would call segmentation of the workforce. Take steps in the medical sphere, which we're not going to be talking about today, and then reduce the R0 factor. Now, this is what epidemiologists refer to as the number of people the average infected person infects. The High Tech Council wants to get it to below 1.0, and that impacts a number of recommendations for the workplace, which we will be talking about today. So very briefly on the issue of segmentation, segmentation would essentially mean having people over 60 work from home or just not work later into the reopening as a way of reducing the risk of overwhelming the healthcare system. And it does carry some benefits for society, but it may carry some real legal risk for employers. We'll touch on this a bit later. But I thought you might find the data on this slide interesting, so we included it. Another concept for segmentation is by industry, which is another way the High Tech Council is looking at this. We don't really have time to spend on it today, but again, it's a concept that you may want to look into if it is relevant to your workplace. And then finally, on this sort of introductory segment from the High Tech Council, this issue of reducing the R factor, or the R0 factor, it's really a fancy way of reducing the rate of spread. And it's really driving the thinking of government policymakers right now with regard to shutdown and reopening orders. So it's important, I think, for employers to be aware of it and understand why they're doing that. The key here is the metric of getting that little number 0. It's not actually 0, but to get it to less than 1, so that each infected person on average infects less than one other person. And that means a whole lot of people who are infected have to infect nobody to get that average down below 1. And that's a big part of what's driving the way in which the states are making the decisions that they're making. So, what are we exactly bringing our workforce back to? Let's talk a little bit about that. May marks the start of a long and incremental resumption of operations. It's going to be highly variable by state, by industry, and it's going to be variable by guidelines from both states and industries. And whether it's short-term, whether we're talking about the short-term or the long-term, what we're bringing our workforce back to is not going to be the way it was before. So we all need to be prepared for this new normal of distancing, disinfecting, and hand washing. And that's what we're going to talk about today, is how you set up a plan in order to have the right things in place. But we wanted to just touch on, before we get into the nuts and bolts of that, we wanted to touch on what your employees are going to be thinking. I think it's important for employers to know that they're going to be dealing with a lot of anxiety and apprehension, and some challenges with employees adapting to the new normal that we need to deal with. So there's near universal agreement that reopening means reopening while controlling the risk of infection as much as possible. So what does that mean for your workplace? Well, it means, we would say that it means safe operation in fact, which means infection control and risk mitigation protocols that we're going to be talking about. It also means safe operation in perception through communication, training, and enforcement, so that your employees and your customers and third parties perceive that your operations are safe. And there are important benefits to this beyond simply reducing the risk of spread, because if you have confident employees and customers, it will be better for your bottom line. You will have a lower likelihood of claims, and if you do have claims, you'll be in a better position to defend against them. So one of the things we want everyone to think about in conjunction with developing your return to work plan is to meet your employees where they are. And that means understanding that they're scared about getting sick, that they're scared about losing their job. They're emotionally fragile from having spent way too much time indoors in isolation or under stay-at-home orders. Some of them are going to be angry. Some of them are going to be skeptical about how well this is going to work, whether the employer really cares, and a host of other items. And some of them are also going to be in financial distress because of various impacts that this crisis has had on them. So I think that it's really important for employers and managers, particularly frontline managers who are going to be dealing with employees, to understand all this, be sympathetic to it, and treat employees with some sympathy and empathy around this issue. So it's not going to be enough just to call them back to work, give them a list of new things they have to worry about, and then send them on their way. You're going to have to engage with them, and that's going to be a really key part of making this work. So a couple of thoughts about that. First, engaging employees with regard to their own personal safety, and that means communicating to them how you will protect them. We think it's a good idea to do that before they come back to work, and so that they're not apprehensive up to the minute that they come through the door. They've got a sense of where they're going and a sense of a reason to think they're going to be in good hands. One way to do that is to find a way to involve them in the development of the protocols that you're going to be asking everyone to follow. While you have to be clear that it's the employer's decision, this is not a negotiation, you're not bargaining with them by any means, you are listening to them, and you do want their input, and you want their suggestions, and make them part of the process. And then make it clear to them also that whatever plans you come up with are going to need to adapt to changes. You know, new learning about the disease, new data about, new economic realities. There could be a number of things that may change. So you don't want to overcommit in your communications. And then another thing, and this is a little bit probably more dicey, but something else that engaging with your employees about could be of benefit is engage with them about the financial condition of your company. What can you share about that with them? You don't want to mislead employees about their job security. And I think it would be helpful if you can engage with them in a way that says, look, here's what we need from you to get through this. And if you and everybody else does what we need you to do to get through this, we'll get through this. So that they have a sense that they have a really important role to play, not just in doing their daily jobs, but in getting the company back to a position of stability. So that leads us to sort of the nuts and bolts of today's discussion. I'm just going to talk very briefly about it and then turn it over to Suzanne. So the question that we ask is, or we're seeking to answer today, is why you need an infectious disease preparedness and response plan. So we think this is one of the most important steps employers can take in order to create a safe workplace in the age of COVID-19. And you're going to see as we go through this that there's a fairly close adherence to OSHA's guidance on all of this, and OSHA's guidance in turn, which you see on this slide, is in a recent publication, 3990. OSHA's guidance in turn is built on well-known and time-tested OSHA workplace safety standards that if you deal with workplace safety on a regular basis will be familiar to you. Now, we didn't limit ourselves to just OSHA. We also have looked at other resources. CDC guidelines are important. Industry guidelines, if available for your specific business, will be things you'll want to consider. And of course, every state has its own return to work protocols, checklists, and that sort of thing, which is a real challenge if you're a multi-state employer, because they aren't really, from what I can tell, they're not really talking to each other. So, for example, what you have to do in Maine is not the same thing you have to do in New Hampshire. And we don't know yet what you'll have to do in Massachusetts. But when they come out with their list, I seriously doubt it's going to be the same as Maine's or New Hampshire's. So this is just the reality. But if you keep your plan high enough level so you don't get caught up in a state-by-state sort of conflict, and then when you get to the time to open, you'll resolve those conflicts. We think you'll be fine. One of the really important aspects of this is that, infection or no infection, stopping the spread, preventing infection is very, very important for a whole host of reasons, but it's not your only risk. And we wanted to be, we just want to call your attention to some other aspects of this, more about this in that final alert, which we're going to be doing later this week. But you need to be, there's a lot of concerns that flow from not having a plan that go beyond just the actual risk of infection getting into your workplace. If you don't have a plan that you enforce, you will have, in all likelihood, an increased number of employees who are not complying with the protocols that you're asking them to comply with. In addition, if that happens, if people don't take it seriously, and if people are cynical about it, then you run the risk of productivity and morale challenges. And then we get to the question of liability. which is a topic unto itself, but I just want to touch on a few points. Number one, employees who get sick at work, if they can prove that that's where they got sick, are likely going to be covered by workers' compensation. And a number of states have issued either guidance or at least informal directives to that effect. So the employee situation itself in your state probably, although I can't speak for every state, but it's probably going to mean a workers' comp claim. But there are others that are not going to be covered by workers' comp. For example, family members. If someone gets sick at work, comes home, infects a family member, and there's an argument to be made that you were negligent in the creation and enforcement of a plan, then maybe that spouse or family member has a claim because it was foreseeable that if somebody got sick, they'd go home and infect somebody else, and you didn't act with appropriate care under the circumstances. There are other claims that we need to be concerned about as well, both age and disability related, for example. And I touched on the whole question of segmentation, which could be both either age or disability based. So that's one issue that you want to be concerned about. You also need to be concerned about confidentiality. You have to keep information that you may gather through the collection of medical information confidential. And so following a plan carefully is one way to make sure that that happens. And then finally, I mentioned this because we've been getting questions about this, the question of waivers. And the question is, why don't I just have tell customers that I want them to sign a waiver if they want me to come into their place of business and do business, or they come into my place of business, whatever the case may be. They want me to sign something that says, it could be going either way. You ask them to sign something that says they're going to hold you harmless, or vice versa. Now, first of all, asking for waivers from employees is almost certainly not going to be legal. It's not legal in any of the jurisdictions that we practice in, and it would be barred by workers' compensation. You can't ask an employee to waive a claim that he or she would have under the Workers' Comp Act. But with regard to third parties, it's a fundamental question of what your relationship is with those third parties, and is that really the best way for you to control your risk, which is to alienate your customers by essentially trying to pass responsibility onto them for things that you control. So our recommendation would be not to do that, unless there may be some industries where businesses where it's the only way you can protect your business. But as a general matter, we don't think that's a good idea. And we'll talk more about that in our alert. So now I'm going to turn this over to Suzanne, and she's going to walk us through the nuts and bolts of how you get your plan. So Suzanne.
Great, thanks, Jim. And good afternoon, everybody. Thanks so much for participating today. So first question that I'm going to try and address very briefly is, why are we talking about OSHA so much? I know that we have a number of different industries represented on this webinar today. Some are healthcare providers, and I know you all are very familiar with OSHA requirements, but many of the folks on the call today are just white-collar workplaces like our own, and we don't really spend a lot of time talking about OSHA traditionally. So it might seem strange to you that we're spending a whole hour talking about how to develop what's in essence an OSHA plan. So I want to just talk about that for 1 minute. There is a general duty clause that applies to all workplaces, and that requires employers to provide a workplace that is free from recognized hazards that are likely to cause death or serious physical harm. Okay, so recognized hazards that are likely to cause serious death or serious physical harm. And essentially what OSHA is saying is COVID-19 is such a hazard. It is a recognized hazard. We've seen it. We know workplaces where people have gotten sick, and certainly in some number of people in our workforce, if they were to contract the virus, they would have serious physical harm and unfortunately possibly even death. So it fits that within that rubric. So because we have a general duty clause and it very much triggers COVID-19, we have to look at OSHA's guidance. All right, so it's not something we're typically doing, but it is absolutely applicable here. So if you are someone that says to yourself, I've never had to worry about OSHA, I'm just going to skip this plan, I just want to caution you that's very risky, because OSHA is taking the position that this is a recognized hazard and is something that all workplaces should be addressing. The other thing to note is that when employees complain, they often go to OSHA. I actually had an OSHA matter, a whistleblower for a SEC matter that was at an OSHA, they get filed at OSHA, and I was talking to an OSHA investigator, and she said they just can't even move. They're getting so many of these complaints. So when an employee feels that they've had to work when it wasn't safe, or they feel that they've somehow been disadvantaged by their employer in the context of this pandemic, they will be going to OSHA. And so having an OSHA, a plan that complies with the OSHA requirements is going to be a really key step in addressing any sort of OSHA complaint. Next slide. Jim, next slide.
So I'm having an unresponsive PowerPoint.
Let's see if I can move it.
1 second.
Okay. All right. I'll just talk through the next slide and we'll get to it when we get to it. As Jim said, the OSHA advice on, or the OSHA guidance on preparing a plan is built on, even though it's for a new pandemic, it's built on very well tested and longstanding other structures. And one of those is the PPE standard and the bloodborne pathogen standard. That goes beyond the scope of our webinar today to talk about those in detail. But if you are interested in looking at the kinds of standards that OSHA imposes with respect to PPE, personal protective equipment, or the bloodborne pathogen standard, which deals with respiratory issues, I would encourage you to take a look at those standards because they may provide some good background for you. All right, so we're talking about OSHA. As Jim mentioned, it's also critically important to keep the CDC in mind. And I think that everyone probably is familiar with how to access the CDC guidelines. I find that they change and get updated. So if you haven't looked at them since the middle of March, it's time to go back and look at them again. We are definitely seeing things changing, including they expanded the list of symptoms just a week or so ago. That was a very helpful change. As we know, the list of symptoms was a little bit too narrow. So we're finding that these issues continue to get updated from the CDC, and you should stay on top of those. In addition, take a look at the section on the CDC website called Prevent Getting Sick, and that will have some helpful information for you. Next slide. All right, so let's talk for a minute about state orders. And Jim mentioned this, and I think that it's important to just focus on the fact that states are doing this differently. They're doing it differently in terms of timing, and they're doing it differently in terms of requirements. The most important thing you can do is know your own state plan for reopening. Now, if you're a multi-state employer, and so many of our clients are, this is going to be challenging. So one question that I've spoken about with a few clients is, do you wait for all states to open, or do you take it one at a time? You know, my advice is there's no one answer to that, depending on what state you're dealing with. If New York is one of your states, and you know, Pennsylvania is another one of your states, they're going to open on very different timetables. You may not want to wait until New York opens, right? I mean, we have reason to anticipate that that will be later than most. So I think that if you feel that it's important for your culture to open consistently across your organization, then, you know, certainly I'm not going to say that that's a mistake. On the other hand, if you have a number of jurisdictions, it may make sense to open, you know, whichever state opens first, open up your office in that state and use it as a little pilot program. How is your plan stacking up? What are you learning about temperature taking? What are you learning about distancing? Is it realistic to keep people in one-way hallways, et cetera? So use it as a little pilot test to see how it's going. So certainly there's no requirement to wait. There's some good reason to take each state as it comes. But overall, if culturally it's better for you to open everyone up together, that's certainly permissible. It is important, Jim mentioned this, I'm just underscoring it here. There is rapid change in this area, and I think that it is very important as we talk about the nuts and bolts of this plan that you see it as a work in progress, that you're constantly going back to it and updating it and addressing any new challenges. I suspect that if states open up too quickly and we see a big surge either in hospitalizations or death rates increase, we may very well very quickly have to deal with an order that brings everybody back to staying at home. So I just think it's important for you to be prepared for adjusting quickly to these issues. Next. All right, so let's dig into the nuts and bolts of this. There's some guidelines. We've offered the link there for the guidelines at OSHA. We do recommend having one plan that addresses all employees, and yet within the plan, you will be evaluating the risk for different groups of employees. Okay, so I'm thinking of this as one big plan, even though within the plan, you'll have very different recommendations depending on the geography or the job that's being done. Now, some bad news here. We are recommending that you issue your plan to all employees and that you get it signed. I realize that is not welcome advice and that it is difficult to do that. An electronic signature, I think, is fine as long as you can demonstrate when an employee received it and when they signed it. So having a paper trail on that is helpful. I say that it's important to get everything signed because, you know, fundamentally you'll be telling employees how they have to conduct themselves. And if they fail to do so, at some point, you may very well have to take disciplinary action. It's going to be very important to make sure that they understand what the requirements are. And so we are recommending a signed acknowledgement of receipt. Okay, Jim, next slide. We have prepared a template plan and we will make it available to you as soon as this presentation is over. It's 5 or 6 pages and it is truly a template. If you were to simply put your company name in there and get everyone to sign it, it would be inadequate. So I just want to make sure that you know that up front. It really is intended to just basically be almost like a workbook, walking you through what you need to be thinking about and putting in for your own workplace. This is a quick outline of the plan. So you start with a company policy. This is a short and sweet, just, you know, demonstrating a commitment to compliance with OSHA and to maintaining a safe and healthy workplace. The bulk of the work will be in B and C. So that's the analysis of exposure risk, the specific infection prevention measures applicable based on the risk level. And we'll talk about all of these in more detail coming right up. And then general infection prevention measures applicable to all positions and locations. A section on the identification and isolation of sick people, which is obviously a critical component of this. Returning to work after a COVID-19 diagnosis. Each workplace is going to have a different expectation around what happens for employees who have tested positive. Travel restrictions applicable to employees. Restrictions on visitors in the workplace. Reporting, enforcement, and their maybe it's frozen again.
Oh, we are. I'm sorry. Hang on. It keeps freezing on me. All right, it's functioning now. Are you on the next one? You're mute. I can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can now.
Okay.
Next slide.
All right, can you move? Yeah, next slide.
Now that's frozen again.
You know, while we're fixing the technical things here, I'll just look at a couple questions. One question, do we have any recommendations for apps that can be used for self-attestation? I don't, but I think it's a good idea. And I apologize that I don't. Does Pierce Atwood keep track of different states' reopening guidelines in one easy spreadsheet? We don't have it in one easy spreadsheet, but what we do have, I'm glad you asked that question, so thanks. We do have on our website, we do have one COVID-19 resource. And if you click on that, you'll see that all of our alerts are organized by topic and then also by state. So you can very easily look down and see our alerts based on each reopening guideline. So we do keep close track of that. And then another question that's a great one: what do you recommend if the federal reopening guidelines do not match what your state recommends? Which should we follow? I'm going to guess
So Suzanne seems to be frozen. I'm hoping everyone else can hear me and that she will unfreeze
states
here.
just go much further than the federal government. So I would comply with your state as the #1 requirement. And in all cases, usually the rule is the tie goes to whatever is going to be more beneficial to the employee. But I definitely would make sure you're staying on top of your state issues. Okay, so here's a sample policy. And as I said, it's short and sweet. This is just establishing your commitment to a safe and healthy workplace. It's mentioning COVID-19, and you do have a choice to make when it comes to your plan. We're recommending that you do a plan specific to COVID-19. Many employers have infectious disease preparedness and response plans that are more generic. Some of them were put into place when we had Ebola and SARS and H1N1, so other pandemics. But in this particular circumstance, the risks of COVID-19, the incredible transmission rates and exposure, and the sorts of measures that will protect against that do seem particular to this virus. So my recommendation is design your plan according to this virus, and then if we need to use the same framework we have some other virus 3 years from now, at least you'll have a starting point. But I wouldn't try and make it too generic at this juncture, because I think we have very specific protocols we need to include for this particular circumstance. I want to also point out the last sentence of this policy in the first paragraph, which is failure to comply with this plan will lead to disciplinary action up to and including termination of an employment. And I think it's really important to recognize that. Once you put something in writing in a plan, then you are going to be held to it. And if you say, we're going to screen everybody who walks into our workplace, and then you don't, that's where you start to build a record of potential negligence. Okay. So as you're developing your plan, make sure you are comfortable sticking with it, and then make sure you're willing to enforce it if employees choose to disregard. Okay, so that's an important part of all this. This is definitely not just some words you're going to put on a piece of paper and put up on a shelf. This really has to be something that you can live with. All right, we also want to make sure that people have a place to ask questions. And the reason for that, there's lots of reasons for that. A, you legitimately want them to get their questions answered. But B, if they someday don't comply and they say to you, well, I couldn't have complied because I didn't understand it, you will be able to say to them, but we directed you to ask questions. If you didn't understand something, the burden was on you to ask about it. So that's also an important protection for employers. Okay, next. All right, so as you saw in the outline, one of the provisions of your plan will just be general infection prevention measures. By now, we are so familiar with them, we can all say them in our sleep. As you're developing your list, look at OSHA's 10 steps to reduce exposure, review the CDC Prevent Getting Sick, review your state-specific guidelines, and all of those will have these familiar hand washing, distancing, face masks, all of the things that you are really used to. I want to spend 1 minute talking about the HVAC system. And this is, in my mind, one of the hardest parts of this plan. As you know, there's risk of exposure to COVID-19 or the virus through the air. So if somebody coughs, it sort of sends out the germs in the air. So your HVAC system is an important thing to consider. Now, people complain about HVAC systems all the time. It's too hot, it's too cold, the air is stale, there's all sorts of issues. When I'm talking about this for these purposes, what I really think you want to do, if you're in a shared workspace, if you are in an office building that has 10 employers, you want to just find out, how is your HVAC system interacting with everybody else's? Because if you are taking all the precautions in the world in your workspace, but you're recirculating air from 5 other workspaces that aren't doing anything, then you're going to create an exposure. I am definitely not telling you to redo your HVAC system, so please don't take that away from this webinar. What I am saying, however, is at least know what your system does and how it interacts with your neighbors. And if there's a glitch, if you think, whoa, we're really at the mercy of the air in 2 other offices, then you might want to think about how you can at least inquire as to what they're doing to protect employees. So again, don't go rushing out and replacing your HVAC system, but at least ask the question, who are we sharing our air with? And do we need to reach out and figure out what steps they're taking? Okay, next. All right, so OSHA really expects employers to analyze the exposure risk, all right? And that is not a one-size-fits-all. Your employees are going to have varied exposure risks depending on what their configuration of their workspace is, what office they're in, what their job duties are. So the fundamental underpinning of your plan is to really look at your workforce and determine who has what exposure risk. And again, it's not one size fits all, it's going to vary. You're going to identify employees as high, medium, or low exposure risk. There's also a very high exposure category for healthcare workers. We'll talk about that in a minute. When you're looking at exposure risk, here are a couple things to keep in mind. First of all, geography. If you're in New York City as opposed to an office outside of the city, those are different exposure risks. You want to make sure you're tracking, when you're doing your analysis, where your employees work. In this regard, even employees in Boston are going to have a different exposure risk than employees in Maine or New Hampshire. Just the number of cases and the number of deaths and hospitalizations are just so much higher in Massachusetts. You can look at that population as being, having a different risk profile. So you want to look at what measures you take for that group in Boston that might be different from other places that have a much lower risk. The other key thing that's going to dictate risk here is the workplace configuration. If somebody has a private office and they're sitting in their private office all day long, they're going to have a very different risk level than someone who's out in an open space with many small cubicles or working on a manufacturing line. So the sort of surge in office design over the last 10 years, which everybody's in a big open space and maybe even sitting close together because you're prioritizing big meeting rooms or big ping pong rooms or kitchens or etc. That configuration of a lot of people in an open space that are close together is going to present more of a problem. So you're going to want to look at what measures to put in place for people who are sitting right next to each other that may be very different from somebody who's sitting in an office. For example, think about face covering. Some states are requiring face covering for all employees, but it may not be illogical to say if you're sitting in your office, you don't have to have your face mask on. As opposed to if you have a bank of assistants right out front of the offices and they're all sitting close together, maybe it's appropriate for them to wear a face mask throughout the entire day. So by looking at exposure risk by individual group, you will be able to determine what are the appropriate steps to protect each different group, okay? The final category to seriously consider is whether your folks are public facing or not. Think about whether customers are interacting. So if your sales team is having to still interact with customers because they have to do a demo or something like that, you want to make sure that you are addressing the risk associated with being customer facing, okay? Your receptionist may very well have the greatest exposure, right? Because she's going to be dealing with the delivery people that come in, the plant person that comes in, all sorts of folks that are coming in from who knows where. So the receptionist is probably someone who's going to have a whole different set of exposure risks. Are you sharing your workspace with somebody else? Do you have more than one? Are you in a WeWork kind of a situation? Are you in just a building that has a lot of offices on the same floor, so you're all sharing a bathroom, or you're all sharing an elevator? All of those different configurations of how people work should be taken into consideration when you're evaluating the risk level. Do we have some questions, Jim, that we should pause on?
Well, here's the problem, Suzanne. That's what's making my slides freeze. Is the question and answer
Okay.
box. So
Okay.
you
All
could
right,
look. It would be helpful.
All right, why don't I take a quick check and see what some new questions might be. Oh, a good question about the acknowledgement. Do you simple acknowledgement of receipt of the whole plan? Yes, you don't have to get, you're not asking employees to sort of agree with every single component of the plan. Thanks for asking, that's a great question. You're just asking them to sign an acknowledgement that they've received the plan and that they understand they're obligated to comply with it. And the template that we have available to you all has that acknowledgement of receipt language right on it, so you can just use that. Okay, good question about how do we handle an employee who refuses to come to work due to a fear. We're going to cover that in just a minute. Okay, some of those are returning to work people. Oh, and there's a lot. Oh, I love these Q&A is very helpful. Hopefully everyone's paying attention to it. There's some nice back and forth within the group talking about different apps or different, Tim Ford talked about an HVAC system. So there's lots of good information in our Q&A. So I encourage everyone to stay on top of that. And I'll come back at the end and see what other questions I can handle. But so far you guys are doing a great job of raising important issues.
And Suzanne, just if I could mention, we will make an effort to respond in writing after the webinar to things we can't get to during the webinar. So we're not going to ignore your questions. We just may not get to them in the time.
All right, so the last thing to think about as you're trying to separate your workforce into different groups depending on their exposure risk is, are they exposed to visitors? And I just want to spend a minute talking about visitors, and we have another slide about visitors coming up. You know, visitors are not all alike. In our own office, you know, we have people who come in and water the plants. We have people who come in and take the shredding box for shredding documents. And then we have occasionally an IT person, an IT consultant who has to come in and look at things. And, you know, it occurs to me, all of those people go right through our entire office. And in the day of the coronavirus, do we need to have all those visitors come right through the whole office? Shouldn't we be thinking about changing the way visitors interact in our spaces so that they don't have to parade down the hallways? So if you have someone who has exposure to visitors, one question you're going to ask yourself is, do they need to? Can we change that? Is that something that we can adjust? But certainly if you have someone like your receptionist or people who sit close to the conference rooms, those folks may have much greater exposure to visitors, and their risk should be evaluated accordingly. Next slide. All right, as I mentioned, OSHA has 4 categories of risk: very high, which is a high potential for exposure to known or suspected sources of COVID-19 during certain procedures. So medical, lab, postmortem tasks involving direct exposure. All right, most people on this webinar are not in the very high category, although I know we do have some medical businesses online. High exposure is high potential for exposure to known or suspected courses. This again is healthcare, medical transport. So they're not engaging in activities that are directly going to put them in touch with the virus, but they're pretty close. Medium, frequent or close contact with people who may be infected, but who are not known or suspected COVID-19 patients. And then low, no required contact with people known to be or suspected of being infected. I'm assuming for purposes of this webinar that most folks on the line are either going to be in the medium or low categories, okay? And that's important because the steps you have to take to address a medium or low risk are very different than the steps you need to take if you have a very high or high risk. So right off the bat, your life is a little bit easier if you're in the medium or low risk. Your plan is going to actually identify which employees are in which categories, okay? You do want to make sure you are specifically stating that your employees are in medium exposure risk or low exposure risk. And then you're going to design your protocols accordingly. So once you have figured out who is in what risk category, the next step is to look at prevention measures. Your prevention measures are going to line up with the exposure risk, all right? So they're going to be different, and that's totally understandable and appropriate. So how do you reduce exposure for employees who work in large open spaces with many other employees in close proximity? So what are the types of measures we're talking about? Well, first of all, move workstations further apart, all right? If you have folks that are really working right on top of each, people are talking about doing this cohorting, which is you have, you know, if you have 20 people that work in a big open office, 10 of them come in every Monday, Wednesday, or Friday, and 10 of them come in Tuesdays and Thursdays, but the same 10 come in at the same time. So they're only exposing themselves to a smaller group of people, okay? So if you can move your workstations apart, great. If you can't, then you have to think about how can you reduce the number of people that are coming in. Face masks, of course, is an important component if you have people that can't distance. And so those are the types of things that would apply if you're in an open space. But again, I don't know that it's necessary for someone who's sitting inside a personal office to have a face mask on. So you don't have to go that far. It's, again, not one size fits all. So how do you reduce exposure for employees exposed to customers or the public? And again, these are just some food for thought, and the plan will include, our template includes a number of these issues as well. So the most important way to reduce exposure for employees who are exposed to customers and the public is to screen the customers and the public, okay? Now, I am not talking about retail here, all right? So obviously for retail, you're not necessarily going to ask everybody who comes into a grocery store if they have any symptoms. You're going to take other steps in terms of, you know, that kind of a retail operation. But again, back to my example of delivery drivers. Or, you know, we're a law firm, so we have sometimes clients come in and meet with us. If we're going to be conducting a client meeting, then, you know, I'm assuming that our protocol will be to screen those clients and ask them, do you have a fever? Do you have a cough? Do you have any of the, you know, 6 symptoms, that's the CDC issues, before they can come into our office and sit in our conference room, okay? In addition, physical barriers are also an important component. And, you know, everybody has seen the plexiglass barriers that we have in a lot of retail operations. Those are great. The other thing I've seen, I saw this at Trader Joe's, and it seemed to make good sense and could be workable in an office setting. You mark on the floor where people can stand. So if you have a reception desk and you want to make sure that delivery folks don't get too close to your receptionist, mark on the floor where delivery people can stand. And then just maybe put up a poster, or maybe have an easel with some instructions for visitors who are coming in. But you just make sure that an individual cannot get right up to the desk so that they're standing over your receptionist. So again, these are physical things that are doable, that help reduce the contact of your employees with the outside. Next slide. So when OSHA talks about preventive measures, they talk about 3 different categories primarily. First of all is engineering controls. The second is administrative controls. And the third is personal protective equipment, or PPE. So I encourage you to think in terms of all 3 of those types of measures when you're evaluating what steps you can take to reduce exposure, okay? Engineering, so there's process design, facility design, workspace design, HVAC. So in your plan, you'll identify medium risk employees, and you'll list them by, you know, job title. And then you'll write down what engineering controls you're imposing to address, to reduce exposure. And those would be all the things we just talked about: moving the desks further apart, limiting the number of people who, or creating a physical barrier. Anything that is design related is going to fit under an engineering control, and you want to specifically list those. And then you want to make sure you do those things. Again, this isn't a paper exercise. It's very important that you only write down what you're willing to comply with. The administrative controls are the ones that are going to be critically important, and they're dicey. Those are policy related, okay? Policies, procedures, and training. This is where I want to spend 1 minute talking about segmentation. And in particular, if you were to say everybody who's over 60 or anybody who has diabetes, you can't work. Don't come into our workplace if you're over 60 and or you have diabetes. That is the surest way to end up with a discrimination claim, okay? So even though we know that employees who are over 60 have a greater chance of having a very hard time with COVID-19, We are not recommending that you have a wholesale refusal to permit people over 60 to come into the workplace. That is surely going to get you an age discrimination claim. So if you have a particularized reason, now I also know that there are a lot of workplaces these days that have people in their 70s. Some even have a handful of employees in their 80s. If you fall into that category, let's have a conversation about how to protect those employees. I think that from my perspective, there's a significant difference between an older workforce that you're directing to not come into work if that means that they're not going to get paid, as opposed to an older workforce where that's the last group to return from a work from home protocol. A work from home is definitely not the same sort of adverse employment action as just staying home and not getting paid. So some of these rules are going to vary based on whether or not working from home is an option. With respect to people who have a medical condition that makes them at greater risk of having a hard time with the virus, anybody who has diabetes or heart disease or one of those issues that really does make this illness much worse, if they say they can't come back to work because of that, or if you decide that you don't want to take that risk, those are going to be accommodations under the ADA, okay? So somebody who says, I'm not comfortable coming to work because I have an underlying medical condition, they are asking you for an accommodation under the ADA or a state law equivalent, and you should handle that accordingly, okay? That usually would require some verification that the individual has that underlying medical condition, and you'd want to look at whether there's an undue hardship created by their accommodation. That's very different from somebody who's afraid to come back to work, right? So somebody who's afraid to come back to work or is just dealing with a stressful life because they have kids at home, that's a different situation. And I think we need to think that one through. Certainly, if you have work available and somebody can't work because they're taking care of school children, that's going to be covered by if you are covered by, if you have fewer than 500 employees, that's going to be covered by the expanded family medical leave. Okay, so you're going to want to make that leave available, again, as one of the administrative controls. If you just have someone who's afraid, I think we should have a conversation, because one of the things that we are hopeful of is that by putting a plan in place and addressing these concerns head on, you will be reducing the reason for employees to be afraid. So if you're taking these steps to promote distancing, if you are having fewer employees in, if you are limiting visitors, if you're taking all these steps that we're recommending, then your employees have much less reason to be worried about coming into the workforce. And so before we say, okay, just force them to come back, which is, could be problematic, I'd want to know a little bit more about how are you doing with complying with your plan? Do you have a robust plan? Are you meeting the expectations of the plan? And then, ultimately, if an employee just decides they can't do it, they're probably in a situation where they're quitting. Now, whether or not that gets them unemployment is a different story. I will tell you, I saw something in New Hampshire that just blew my mind. In a guideline, it's not part of the order, but in a guideline it said, well, and if you're afraid to come back to work, you can just stay out on unemployment. And I thought, wait a minute, that's not really how it's supposed to work. So we'll get more information about orders, but certainly if an employee decides, notwithstanding all of your protections, that they just can't do it, in my mind, they're quitting. And they shouldn't be eligible for unemployment, although they may be. So we can talk about more of that offline if you have a particular circumstance. And then finally, PPE. Obviously, the whole question of face masks is an important one. I think if you have N95 masks, that's obviously the gold standard. But my understanding is that any sort of cloth mask is going to be helpful in some way or another. Certainly gloves, if somebody has to be handling a thermometer or something like that, you want to make sure people are gloved. Obviously, readily available hand sanitizer is important. Places where you can wash your hands, that's important. So again, those PPE issues are things we're all super familiar with. But in your plan, you're going to want to address engineering, administrative, and personal protective equipment for each risk category. Okay, so we're going to skip over the safe work practices. I think we're kind of running out of time here, so let's just move on to a couple of examples. So we just picked two random folks to see what kinds of protections would we be talking about for these people. So for a sales employee, first of all, likely they're going to be a medium risk, and their exposure really is to customers and any required attendance at a sales meeting. So the specific infection prevention measures that you would take and that you would include in your plan would be virtual meetings whenever possible, large conferences prohibited, small group meetings with customers permitted, but customers must be screened and attendees must remain 6 feet apart, use of a face mask required whenever outside of the office, work from home whenever not meeting with customers. And let me just spend 1 minute on that one. So if you have a salesperson that just, in order for them to do their job, they have to sometimes meet with a customer. Hopefully you're going to reduce that. But if they do it at all, and I accept the fact that sometimes that would be required, then you don't want that person to come back into the workforce and potentially infect anybody in the workforce. So possibly what you want to do with your salespeople is if they have to meet with somebody, then maybe otherwise they're working from home, so they're not bringing that exposure into the workplace. Please understand, I'm not saying that any of this is required. This is just the type of thing you should be thinking about for each category of employee. And it's going to vary depending on your own details. These are just some of the ideas, but this is how it's going to look, something like this. Okay, Jim, next. That's different from an IT manager, right? So an IT manager is probably low risk because they have no exposure to customers or the public, but they do have a regular exposure to numerous coworkers. So if you have an IT person, if you're back up and running and you have an IT person that's regularly getting questions from coworkers, now that's their primary risk of exposure. But you're already screening or doing whatever you're doing with respect to employees. So there's not too much more to do with an IT manager. Of course, you want to include in your plan the requirement that the IT person should sanitize all hardware before working on it. So before they start working on someone else's equipment, make sure they sanitize it. Encourage to the greatest extent possible, if not requiring, that coworkers only work remotely. If all your IT team is close together in one sort of bullpen kind of a setup, ensure that there's adequate distancing between workstations. So you'll see that what you have to do to protect an IT manager is different than what you have to do to protect a sales employee if the sales employee is interacting with customers. And that's really how you want to look at each category of employee. All right, next. All right, so let's talk a bit about testing. I think that's probably on everybody's mind today. So first of all, let's get our language straightened out. What do we mean when we talk about testing? There's really a couple different options. There's a screening questionnaire, there's temperature taking, and then there's an actual testing for COVID-19. The other question is, who are you talking about? Are you talking about employees? Are you talking about customers, vendors, the public entering your workplace? You might have a different answer depending on who you're talking about. The other issue is when. When are you doing the testing? Are you talking about doing it daily? Are you talking about confirming a negative test after someone has been diagnosed? Are you talking about it only for visitors or customers who enter the workplace? So understanding what type of testing you're talking about, who you're considering testing, and when, those are critical components in doing this analysis. Next. A quick minute about the EEOC. So we've been talking a lot about OSHA. The EEOC also has issued guidance on this issue. And the question in particular is, when may an ADA-covered employer take the body temperature of employees during the COVID-19 pandemic? Who ever thought we would be talking about taking the temperature of our employees? It's just beyond the pale. In fact, if you had asked me 8 months ago, can I take my employees' temperatures? I would have said, absolutely not, don't ever consider it. That's a medical examination, and you really have to have a pretty specific business reason for doing that. I think this is going to be what comes out of this pandemic, is we're going to all get a lot more comfortable with our body temperatures being taken in a whole variety of situations. So what the EEOC says is, because the CDC and state and local health authorities have acknowledged community spread of COVID-19 and issued attendant precautions, employers may measure employees' body temperatures, okay? However, employers should be aware that some people with COVID-19 do not have a fever. So basically the answer is yes, you can do it. That's not the same thing as saying that you must do it or should do it. It's just that the prohibition has been removed and you can do it. But, and there's a certain satisfaction to temperature testing, right? It's like this immediate gratification, the person has a fever or doesn't have a fever and everybody feels better. It's the window dressing that may make people feel more comfortable about working. The problem is it's not enough in and of itself. There are plenty of people who have COVID-19 who don't have a fever. So if all you're doing is temperature testing, you're not really addressing fully the exposure. In addition, you're taking somebody's temperature at 8 in the morning. Oftentimes if somebody's sick, their fever spikes at 4 in the afternoon or 6 in the afternoon. So you may not even really be capturing somebody who is going to have a fever later that day. So you're certainly permitted to do temperature testing, but don't get overly enthusiastic or thrilled about how protective that is, because it's just one data point at one moment in time, and it's not everything. It's not nothing, but it's not everything. Okay. I think that in conjunction with temperature testing, it's very important to give either employees or visitors, if you're considering doing temperature testing, screening questions. All right, so in addition to temperature, ask some screening questions about other current symptoms. I do think it makes sense to think about doing it at the beginning of every day. If you're going to be screening people, that's a logical time to do it. I am aware of some industries where they're temperature testing 4 times a day, and just because of recognizing that a temperature at 7 in the morning doesn't necessarily give you a whole lot of information. The questions related to the symptoms, we all know them: cough, shortness of breath, fever, chills, muscle pain, headache, sore throat, loss of taste and or smell. And as we've been saying, keep your eye on the CDC and what some other symptoms may be. Stay current on that as we learn more about this virus. Okay, next. So how do you do the screening? Are you going to rely on self-screening, or are you going to require something a little more involved? So New Hampshire is requiring screening. If you are a business that is in operation in New Hampshire right now, you are required to appoint somebody to ask questions about symptoms and take and record somebody's temperature. All right. That's one way of doing it. You're making somebody else do the testing. Another way to do it is have an employee take their own temperature. That's certainly something that creates risk that somebody is not going to be honest with you, but it also reduces the exposure to the person who would be, writing down the temperature. So having the employees do it themselves is something that makes good sense, but also creates the potential for someone to not be honest. Your leave policies are going to play an important role here. If an employee who has a fever of 100 degrees or 100.4 or higher, and those are the 2 numbers I've seen, anywhere from 100 to 100.4 as the threshold that gets you sent home. If an employee who tests with that temperature is sent home and is not paid, and you rely on an employee doing their own testing, you're going to have a greater risk that that employee is not going to be truthful. All right, so your leave policies and how you handle the time out of work when somebody is sick with a fever, that's going to be a pretty important detail in your plan in terms of whether or not it's safe to rely on self-reporting. Okay, so there's an interesting set of statistics here that show what are the symptoms that people are most seeing with a positive COVID-19 test. And it's interesting to me that the gastrointestinal stuff, diarrhea and vomiting, is pretty low, but they are seeing that in some cases. Obviously, fever, sinus pain, cough, altered sense of smell, you see much more regularly. I think we're in a tough time right now because there's allergies. Lots of people are coughing and sneezing and having sinus pain right at this moment. So separating out who's going through seasonal allergies versus who's got COVID-19 is going to be challenging, but that's unfortunately the world we're in right now. Okay, next. So a couple examples of people who are doing screening in Wuhan, China, the origin of this virus. All arriving employees must submit to at least 4 temperature checks daily. And Amazon is using thermal cameras at its operations facilities to screen workers. Some grocery stores are using non-contact forehead infrared thermometers. And I want to take 1 minute to talk about that. I was looking at that issue for a client. The technology they were considering was essentially a facial recognition program that added the infrared temperature scan. Couple things, if you are considering technology that has facial recognition, there are some privacy concerns to worry about. So talk with your employment counsel about the privacy aspects of that. In addition, the FDA has issued guidance on telethermographic devices for measuring temperature. And one of the labeling requirements for such devices is that the label has to say that a positive temperature should be confirmed with a contact thermometer. Okay, now that's a labeling requirement, which is very different than saying you're required to confirm a positive temperature test, but it just introduces this question of whether the thermographic temperature reading is going to be accurate enough. You may, before you send somebody home, if you've done it with one of these temperature scans, you may very well want to confirm with a contact thermometer. Colorado has announced that temperature checks will be part of the reopening plan. That's also the case in New Hampshire. Again, if all you're doing is testing the temperature, that's not effective. That's not enough. You need to also look at other symptoms. There's lots of challenges with doing temperature testing, right? Ensuring appropriate PPE for the person who takes the temperatures, getting enough thermometers. There's all sorts of issues like that. Remember that if you are keeping a log of temperatures, that's a confidential medical log, and you want to make sure you are treating it, accordingly. You certainly want to take steps to ensure that supervisors and managers do not have access to the information about everybody's temperatures. I definitely am worried about employees, sort of harassing folks who are coughing or who have symptoms, who's runny nose or who had a temperature or whatever. We have some real risks here of employee misconduct. So you want to make sure that anybody that's doing this temperature taking is keeping a log that's going to be treated very confidentially. Okay, you do not have to have medical personnel taking the test. I think we covered that. Somebody should be trained though, right? And you want to make sure that you have nailed down in your plan how that communication will be. So if whoever's taking the temperature, who do they report that to? And what happens next? Your plan should address all of that in those details, okay? It would be a disaster to have a plan under which somebody recorded temperatures and then nothing happened, right? The temperature taking is step one, and then there has to be some action taken based on the results. So make sure your plan addresses that. Again, 100 or 100.4 is usually the acceptable cutoff. All right. Now, this says take 3 readings and use the average. I understand that that's a protocol that many people recommend. I'm not so sure that that's a requirement. I think that might just be one way of doing it. This is going to depend on what kind of thermometer you're using. The temperature check also raises the question of pay. If you have a lot of hourly employees who are having to queue up for a long time to get their temperature taken, I think you're going to want to address the pay component of that. My advice would be to pay them for that. But it may be that if you're talking about a long period of time, let's talk about that. Maybe we would have different advice in a particular circumstance, but think about when you're doing the temperature check in relationship to when somebody is punching in, so that you can make sure you're not running into any sort of wage and hour issues around that.
Yeah, Suzanne, just to jump in on the 3 reading issue, if I could, this I think is coming from OSHA as a recommendation. One of the challenges is that the quality of the thermometers that are in the marketplace is highly variable. There's a lot of junk, and one reading from a junky thermometer may actually not tell you anything. So in terms of getting something you could actually consider to be actionable information, that's why the 3 reading suggestion.
All right, thanks, Jim. Yeah, and I certainly think, if somebody has a 97.2, maybe you decide to just move on and test the next person. But if you're about to send somebody home, then I think it would make sense to take another temperature and make sure that the second time around it's stuck, or the third reading sticks. So again, you might develop a protocol that's really focused on just confirming if somebody is about to be sent home, as opposed to worrying about someone whose temperature is low. Okay, next. So that was all about temperature testing, okay? Screening questionnaires about symptoms is kind of the easiest to justify, the easiest to implement. Temperature taking is one step more complicated. You're really having potentially bodily fluids if you have a contact thermometer, so you got to really worry about the PPE in terms of that. But sort of the far end of the spectrum is actually doing COVID-19 tests. The EEOC has answered the question, may an employer administer a COVID-19 test before permitting employees to enter the workplace? And the answer is yes. An employer may choose to administer COVID-19 testing to employees before they enter the workplace to determine if they have the virus. Now, this is worded such that I think the EEOC is imagining that the employer is actually doing the testing. Obviously, that's significantly easier if you're a medical workplace, but if you're a non-medical workplace and you don't have a nurse on staff, I think the employer doing the testing is going to be a little more complicated. Next slide. I think that the right way to think about COVID-19 tests for the average workplace is to think about it only in terms of when somebody's returning to work after a positive COVID-19 test. So screening everybody with a COVID-19 test is probably not realistic, including because it's one day. I mean, are you really going to do this every single day? And it's very burdensome for not a whole lot of return. Most people will test negative, so you're spending a lot of time and money on something where most people are going to test negative anyway. But if you have a situation where somebody has tested positive and they're returning to work, I think that's a totally different ballgame. All right, next slide, Jim. I thought we had a slide here. Oh, you know where it is? In the template, you'll see in the template that we address the returning to work after a positive COVID-19 test. I don't want to get bogged down in that right now, but the CDC has issued some interesting guidance on that issue. And basically, I think they're trying to say, you cannot expect every employee who's tested positive to have 2 negative tests before they come back to work. That may just not be feasible given our testing issues. So take a look at the template. It sort of lays out a plan that you can use for bringing people back to work if they've had a positive COVID-19 test. One more quick minute on visitors in the workplace. First of all, eliminate non-essential visitors, change the location of visits, create a barrier, reduce the number of chairs in a conference room to enforce distancing, screen all visitors with a questionnaire. I personally think that if you are not excited about testing all of your employees for temperature, you should at least think about testing visitors. That's a whole population where your employees, we don't know anything about the people who are coming in. They're not, we don't see them every single day. We don't know what their lifestyle is like in terms of travel and other things. So if you're going to just segment one group to temperature tests, think about doing those. And I also think it would be reasonable for a visitor to administer the thermometer, the temperature check, and then just write down their temperature on a screening questionnaire and sign it. I think that's an appropriate thing to ask a visitor to do, a FedEx driver, et cetera. Okay, I think now, Jim, we're back to you, unless we're kind of running out of time here. So back to Jim to finish it up, and then we'll address the questions offline after the webinar is over.
Yeah, so let me, thank you, Suzanne. Let me just wrap this up with a few final points. The plan that you will go to all this effort to create it has to be communicated effectively. And as I mentioned at the beginning, engage with your employees, maybe in the development of the plan, but certainly before they come in on the existence of the plan, to explain to them how you're going to keep them safe. And here are the reasons why you should be very good at communicating this plan. to your entire workforce. And those points speak for themselves. I'm not going to read them, but anyway, I think those are important reasons. And then in terms of how you think about communicating the plan, it's really important to communicate your expectations about the plan so that the workforce knows that management is serious and fully intends to stand behind the plan, enforce the plan, make the plan understandable. Don't just hand the plan to employees, but give them a summary of what they need to understand in terms of their day-to-day time in the workplace. Make it easily accessible for them. So more than one place where they can find the summary. Don't just communicate it the day they show up, but keep reminding people about it so that it's reinforced and it starts to become sort of part of their habits of work. If things change, communicate that quickly. We would recommend making sure that your customers and public who interact with your business know that you have a plan and understand the basics of it. Not going to give them the details you give your employees, but they should be aware that you're a safe workplace and here's how you're making sure of that. Suzanne talked about the reporting of concerns. That's very important. And someone needs to be accountable for responding to those concerns so that employee concerns or complaints or whatever just don't disappear, but they actually get addressed. I think one final point that I want to make, next to last slide, one point I want to make to emphasize strongly on the enforcement question is that, look, we understand no one wants to start writing people up over hand washing and distancing, but the concern here is that compliance with your plan will deteriorate quickly if people perceive that the protocols are more for show and you're not really serious about enforcing them. So you can't let failure to follow the protocols just go. Obviously, if it's unintentional, you understand people are learning to adapt, that this is new. That can be dealt with coaching, but that's an opportunity to really drive home the importance. But if people are just intentionally not following the protocols, then you have to discipline them in some way. And if your managers are intentionally not following the protocols, your discipline has to be serious so that people understand this isn't going to be tolerated. And be particularly concerned that the first time you discipline, you are setting the precedent that will set the tone for this whole thing in your workplace. So those first actions will be very, very important. You obviously need to be careful not to discriminate in the way you go about enforcing the plan, and understand that if you don't take this seriously, you increase your own risk, both of infection and of liability. And then finally, on the issue of documentation, which is an important, an enduring aspect of your plan, you need to record incidents that employees report to you, both in terms of complaints and in terms of their sickness or their experiencing of symptoms. Let's do the latter first. So when employees say they're sick or they're experiencing symptoms, you want to take a prompt identification and isolation steps. Those are all going to be spelled out in your plan. But you also want a record of that, because you want to document that under the plan, someone came forward, they said they had these are those symptoms, you made note of it, and then you protect that information, but you keep track of it. And then with regard to complaints, again, this is a liability protection issue primarily. But when employees report that they think something is unsafe or that someone's not complying with the plan, you need to keep a record of it, and you need to encourage it so that employees know that if they come forward, they will be heard, and you'll do something about it. And that is a really valuable defense should you get a visit from OSHA sometime down the road. So we have reached the end of our time. We've actually gone over a little, and I apologize. I want to thank everybody very, very much for your attention today. Thank you, Suzanne. Enjoyed very much hearing about this. I want to wish everybody good luck getting your employees back to work to full productivity and to getting these plans activated. We're happy to help with any of that. Reminder that this webinar and the plan template that Suzanne mentioned is going to be posted to our website shortly, and will be available to you and anyone else who is interested. And finally, I hope everyone has a great spring. Thank you very much.
And just, Jim, let me just jump in and say we have a lot of great questions, and thank you all for your engagement with your great questions. We will respond to them. Julie will our marketing people will figure out how we get that back out to you, but we will respond to all the questions, and you'll see that in some format this afternoon. Thanks so much, everybody. Take care.